words Mount Everest are synonymous with personal challenge. For countless climbers, scaling the world's tallest peak at more than 29,000 feet has been a lifelong dream. But reaching the summit requires months of training and preparation, support from local guides, significant financial resources, and even a bit of luck. Today, around 600 people reach the top of Mount Everest every year. That's according to National Geographic. Just a few decades ago, that number was closer to a few dozen per year. Equally rare in those days were medical personnel who also had the skills to make it up the mountain. So in the 1980s, when a young medical student was asked to join a small expedition as the team's doctor, she knew she couldn't pass up the opportunity.
I was a 25-year-old medical student studying in the Bronx. I had grown up in New York City, so not your typical mountaineering type of person. But when I was invited to be the medical person for this climb, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity. I thought it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, which it ended up being. But what I often say is me serving as the doctor while still a medical student was sort of like my Everest.
That's Dr. Mimi Zieman. She writes about her experience in her memoir, Tap Dancing on Mount Everest, a young doctor's unlikely adventure. Zieman became interested in mountain climbing when she attended college in Denver, and at age 22, she completed a solo hiking trip through Nepal. When the Everest crew learned of her Nepal expedition, they thought Zieman would be a welcome addition to their team.
I had met them after several months of hiking, so they kind of saw what I was capable of physically and decided to trust in that.
But Zieman didn't know anything about high-altitude medicine. She was still a student and had only a year and a half to prepare for the trip.
I went to the library and photocopied articles, and I sort of learned everything about high-altitude medicine that was written up to that time in terms of prevention, the sort of conditions we would likely encounter, how to treat them. And, I studied sort of every night and weekend during that time preparing.
Zieman says the most common high-altitude sickness she prepared for was mountain sickness, which can happen any time you're high above sea level. But when Zieman and the crew arrived in Tibet, some of the climbers quickly experienced upper respiratory infections and more serious conditions.
One of our climbers was high up on the mountain and showing symptoms of high-altitude pulmonary edema and cerebral edema. Those are the most serious high-altitude conditions. And he was cognizant enough to know he needed to descend immediately. By the time he got to me, which was many, many thousands of feet below him, he was mostly cured. In contrast, the climbers that had severe frostbite that got back to me was something that I had to treat.
The climbers were at an even greater risk of medical issues because they were ascending the mountain without supplemental oxygen.
And we were on the most remote face of Everest, the east face in Tibet. We saw no other people for several months. So that's a little different than what you imagine today when you see those long lines on Everest in Nepal. So we were isolated. And because they had no supplemental oxygen going to extreme altitudes, they were very at risk.
Zieman spent most of her time at the team's base camp, located at an altitude of around 18,000 feet. She says she slept in down overalls with hot water bottles and a parka every night. In addition to the unrelenting frigid temperatures, Zieman was also in constant fear of avalanches.
One of the chapters in my book is how to ride an avalanche. And you're supposed to put your feet downhill, tuck your arms in close, keep your ice axe nearby in case you can use it to stop your fall. I was never in an avalanche. We experienced 12 to 15 avalanches a day coming down from Everest and the surrounding mountains, not usually reaching our camp, but hearing the most loud sound you can possibly imagine.
But the scariest moment for Zieman was when 3 of the climbers disappeared for days. She says she feared the worst.
We waited days for them, and we felt that there was no longer a way they could still be alive. They were in the death zone, which is an extreme elevation above 8,000 meters, and we packed up camp, and that was devastating. The 3 climbers that were missing did eventually return to us, and had severe frostbite.
All 3 climbers had several of their fingers and toes amputated as a result of frostbite. Out of the team, only 1 member made it to the summit.
These were very experienced high-altitude mountaineers. Again, unlike what you see in those long lines in Nepal nowadays. You couldn't go to Everest in those days unless you had a very experienced CV of climbing. So they had been with people in the past who had perished on mountaineering trips. They had seen frostbite. They knew all the risks very well. This was their passion. This is what they lived for.
Although Zieman never returned to the Himalayas, more than 2 decades later, she says any mountain is her happy place.
It's a very spiritual place to be in the Himalayas. What drew me was that vastness, that quiet, that stillness, that beauty. I try to capture all of that in the book. And I think when we can connect with nature in that way, we also connect with deeper parts of ourselves. I also believe that the risks I took and even the devastation helped me connect with the deeper parts of myself and made me stronger. And so I do believe part of why I wrote the book too is that it is worth following your passions, even if it involves some fear and risk sometimes, if it will help you reach some of those deeper places in yourself.
Mimi Zieman's book, Tap Dancing on Mount Everest, A Young Doctor's Unlikely Adventure, is available now online and in select bookstores. To find out more about our guests this week, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Instagram, X, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our lead producer is Libby Foster. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.